Chapter 9 of Tante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. Tante by Anne Douglas Sedgwick. Chapter 9. On a chill sunny morning in April, Gregory Jardine went out onto his balcony before breakfast and stood leaning there as was his wont, looking down over his view. The purpling treetops in the park emerged from a light morning mist. The sky, of the palest blue, seemed very high and was streaked with white. Spring was in the air, and he could see daffodils shining here and there on the slopes of green. He had just read Karen Woodruff's last letter, and he was in the mood, charmed, amused, and touched, that her letters always brought. Never, he thought, had there been such sweet and such funny letters, so frank and so impersonal, so simple and so mature. During these months of their correspondence, the thought of her had been constantly in his mind, mingling now not only with his own deep and distant memories, but it seemed with hers, so that while she still walked with him over the heels of his boyhood and stooped to look with him at the spring gushing from under the bracken, they also brushed together the dry, soft snow from the trailing arbutus, or stood above the sea on the Cornish headlands. Never in his life had he so possessed the past and been so aware of it. His youth was with him, even though he still thought of his relation to Karen Woodruff as a paternal and unequal one, imagining a crisis in which his wisdom and knowledge of the world might serve her. A foolish love affair, perhaps, that he would disentangle, or a disaster connected with the great woman under whose protection she lived. He could so easily imagine disasters befalling Madame von Marwitz and involving everyone around her. And now in a week's time he would be in Cornwall and seeing again the little Hans Andersen heroine. This was the thought that emerged from the sweet vagrancy of his mood, and as it came he was pierced suddenly with a strange rapture and fear that had in it the very essence of the springtime. Gregory had continued to think of the girl he was to marry in the guise of a Constance Armitage, and although Constant Armitage's engagement to another man found him unmoved, except with relief, for the solution of what had really ceased to be a perplexity, since apparently he could not manage to fall in love with her, this fact had not been revealing, since he still continued to think of Constance as the type, if she had ceased to be the person. Karen Woodruff was almost the last type he could have fixed upon. She fitted nowhere into his actual life. She only fitted into the life of dreams and memories. So now, still looking down at the trees and daffodils, he drew a long breath and tried to smile over what had been a trick of the imagination, and to relegate Karen to the place of half-humorous dreams. He tried to think calmly of her. He visualized her in her oddity and childlikeness, seeing the flat blue bows of the concert, the old-fashioned gold locket of the tea, the sealskin cap of the station. But still it was apparent the infection of the season was working in him, for these trivial bits of her personality had become overwhelmingly sweet and wonderful. The essential Karen infused them. Her limpid gray eyes looked into his. She said, so ridiculously, so adorably, "My guardian likes best to be called von Marwitz by those who know her personally." She laughed. The tip of her tongue caught between her teeth. From the place of dream and memory, the living longing for her actual self emerged indomitably. Gregory turned from the balcony and went inside. He was dazed. Her primroses stood about the room in the white and blue bowls. He wanted to kiss them. Controlling the impulse, which seemed to him almost insane, he looked at them instead and argued with himself. In love? But one didn't fall in love like that between shaving and breakfast. What possessed him was a transient form of idée fixe, and he had behaved very foolishly in playing fairy godfather to a dear little girl. But at this relegating phrase his sense of humour rose to mock him. He could not relegate Karen Woodruff as a dear little girl. It was he who had behaved like a boy, while she had maintained the calm simplicities of the mature. He hadn't the faintest right to hope that she saw anything in his correspondence but what she had herself brought to it. Fear fell more strongly upon him. He sat down to his breakfast, his thoughts in inextricable confusion, and while he drank his coffee and glanced nervously down the columns of his newspaper, 100 little filaments of memory ran back and linked the beginning to the present. It had not been so sudden. It had been there beside him, in him, and he had not seen it. The meeting of their eyes in the long, grave interchange at the concert had been full of presage. And why had he gone to tea at Mrs. Forrester's? And why, above all why, had he dreamed that dream? It was his real self who had felt no surprise when, at the edge of the forest, she had said, "And I love you." The words had been spoken in answer to his love. Gregory laid down his paper and stared before him. He was in love. Should he get over it? Did he want to get over it? Was it possible to get over it if he did want to? And this was the culmination. Would she have him? These questions drove him forth. When Barker, his man, came to clear away the breakfast things, he found that the bacon and eggs had not been eaten. Barker was a stone-grey personage who looked like a mid-Victorian Liberal statesman. His gravity often passed into an air of despondent responsibility. "Mr. Jardine hasn't eaten his breakfast," he said to his wife, who was Gregory's cook. "It's this engagement of Miss Armytage's. He was more taken with her than we'd thought." Gregory had intended to motor down to Cornwall, still a rare opportunity in those days. A friend who was going abroad had placed his car at his disposal. But he sent the car ahead of him, and on the first day of his freedom started by train. Next day he motored over to the little village near the Lizard. It was a pale, crystalline spring day. From heights where the car seemed to poise like a bird in mid-air, one saw the tranquil blue of the sea. The woods were veiled in young green, and the hedges thickly starred with blackthorn. Over the great Goonhilly Downs a silvery sheen trembled with impalpable colour, and the gorse everywhere was breaking into gold. It was a day of azure, illimitable distances, of exultation and delight. Even if one were not in love, one would feel oneself a lover on such a day. Gregory had told himself that he would be wise, that he would go discreetly and make sure not only that he was really in love, but that there was in his love a basis for life. Marriage must assure and secure his life, not disturb and disintegrate it. And a love resisted and put aside unspoken may soon be relegated to the place of fond and transient dream. Perhaps the little Hans Andersen heroine would settle happily into such a dream. How little he had seen of her! But while he thus schooled himself, while the white roads curved and beckoned, and unrolled their long ribbons, the certainties he needed of himself merged more and more into the certainties he needed of her, and he felt his heart, in the singing speed, lift and fly towards the beloved. He had written to her and told her the hour of his arrival, and at a turning he suddenly saw her standing above the road on one of the stone stiles of the country. Dressed in white and poised against the blue while she kept watch for his coming, she was like a calm, far-gazing figurehead on a ship, and the ship that bore her seemed to have soared into sight. She was new, yet unchanged. Her attitude, her smile, as she held up an arresting hand to the chauffeur, filled him with delight and anxiety. It disconcerted him to find how new she was. He felt that he spoke confusedly to her when she came to shake his hand. "People often lose their way in coming to see Tante," she said, and it struck him, even in the midst of his preoccupation with her, as too sweetly absurd that the first sentence she spoke to him should sound the familiar chime. They have gone mistakenly down the lane that leads to the cliff path, that one there, or the road that leads out to the moors, and one poor man was quite lost and never found his way to us at all. It meant, for he had only a day or two to spend in England, that he did not see her for another year. Tante has had signs put up since then, but even now people can go wrong." She mounted beside the chauffeur so that she could guide him down the last bit of road, sitting sideways, her arm laid along the back of the seat. From time to time she smiled at Gregory. She was a person who accepted the unusual easily and with no personal conjecture. She was so accustomed, no doubt, to the sudden appearance of all sorts of people that she had no discriminations to apply to his case. There was no shyness and no surmise in her manner. She smiled at him as composedly as she had smiled over the great wall of china in Mrs. Forrester's drawing room, and her pleasure in seeing him was neither less frank nor more intimate. She wore a broad hat of sunburnt straw and a white serge coat and skirt that looked as if they had shrunk in frequent washings. Her white blouse had the little frills at neck and wrists, and around her throat was the gold locket on its black ribbon. Her eyes, when she turned them on him and smiled, seemed to open distances like the limitlessness of the moorland. Her tawny skin and shining golden hair were like the gorse and primroses, and she was in her serenity and gladness like the day personified. They did not attempt to talk through the loudly purring monotones of the car, which picked its way swiftly and delicately down the turning road, and then skimmed lightly on the level ground between hedges of fuchsia and veronica. As the prospect opened, Karen pointed to the golden shoulder of a headland bathed in sunlight and the horizon line of the sea beyond. They turned among the wind-bitten Cornish elms, leaning inland, and Gregory saw among them the glimmer of Les Solitudes. It was a white-walled house with a high-pitched roof of grey shingles, delicately rippling. A house almost rustic, yet more nearly noble, very beautiful, simple yet unobtrusively adapted to luxury. Simplicity reigned within, though one felt luxury there in a chrysalis condition, folded exquisitely and elaborately away and awaiting the return of the enchantress. Karen led him across the shining spaces of the hall and into the morning room. Books, flowers, and sunlight seemed to furnish it, and with something austere and primitive to make it the most fitting background for herself. But while her presence perfected it for him, it was her guardian's absence that preoccupied Karen. Again, and comically, she reminded Gregory of the sacristan explaining to the sightseer that the famous altarpiece had been temporarily removed, and that he could not really judge the chapel without its culminating and consecrating object. "If only Tante were here," she said. "It seems so strange that anyone should see Les Solitudes who has not seen her in it. I do not remember that it has ever happened before. This is the dining room, yes. I like to show it all to you. She planned it all herself, you know. Is it not a beautiful room? You see, though we are Les Solitudes, we can seat a large dinner party, and Tante has sometimes many guests. Not often, though. This is her place of peace and rest. She collected all this Jacobean furniture. Connoisseurs say that it is very beautiful. The music room, alas, is closed, but I will show you the garden, and Mrs. Talcott in it. I am eager for you and Mrs. Talcott to meet." He would rather have stayed and talked to her in the morning room, but she compelled him, rather as a sacristan compels the slightly bewildered sightseer, to pass on to the next point of interest. She led him out to the upper terrace of the garden, which dropped, ledge by ledge, with low walls and winding hedges, down the cliffside. She pointed out to him the sea front of the house, with its wide veranda and clustered trees, and the beautiful dip of the roof over the upper windows, far-gazing little dormer windows above these. Tante, she told him, had designed the house. "This is her room, the corner one," she said. "She can see the sunrise from her bed." Gregory was interested neither in Madame von Marwitz's advantages nor in her achievements. He asked Karen where her own room was. It was at the back of the house, she said. A dear little room, far up. She, too, had a glimpse of the eastern headland and of the sunrise. They were walking along the paths, their borders starred as yet frugally with hints of later glories, but already the arbrisha and arabis made bosses of white or purple on the walls, and in a little copse daffodils grew thickly. "This is Mrs. Talcott," said Karen, quickening her pace. Evidently she considered Mrs. Talcott, in her relation to Tante, as an important feature of Les Solitudes. It was her relation to Karen that caused Gregory to look with interest at the stout old lady, dressed in black alpaca, who was stooping over a flower border at a little distance from them. He had often wondered what this sole companion of Karen's cloistered life was like. Mrs. Talcott's skirts were short, her shoes thick-soled and square-toed, fastening with a strap and button over white stockings at the ankle. She wore a round straw hat, like a child's, and had a basket of gardening implements beside her. "Mrs. Talcott, here is Mr. Jardine," Karen announced as they approached her. Mrs. Talcott raised herself slowly and turned to them, drawing off her gardening gloves. She was a funny-looking old woman, funnier than Karen had prepared him for finding her, and uglier. Her large face, wallet-shaped and sallow, was scattered over with white moles, or rather warts, one of which, on her eyelid, caused it to droop over her eye and to blink sometimes suddenly. She had a short, indefinite nose and long, large lips firmly folded. With its updrawn hair and impassivity her face recalled that of a Chinese image, but more than of anything else she gave Gregory the impression, vaguely and incongruously tragic, of an old, shipwrecked piece of oaken timber, washed up finally out of reach of the waves, on some high, lonely beach, battered, though still so solid, salted through and through, crusted with brine, and with odd, bleached excrescences, like barnacles, adhering to it. Her look of almost inhuman cleanliness added force to the simile. "Mr. Jardine heard Tante last winter, you know," said Karen, "and met her at Mrs. Forrester's." "I'm very happy to make your acquaintance, sir," said Mr. Talcott, giving Gregory her hand. "Mrs. Talcott is a great gardener," Karen went on. "Tante has the ideas and Mrs. Talcott carries them out, and sometimes they aren't easy to carry out, are they, Mrs. Talcott?" Mrs. Talcott, her hands folded at her waist, contemplated her work. "Mitchell made a mistake about the campanulas, Karen," she remarked. "He's put the clump of blue over yonder instead of the white." "Oh, Mrs. Talcott!" Karen turned to look. "And Tante specially wanted the white there, so that they should be against the sea. How very stupid of Mitchell!" "They'll have to come out, I presume," said Mrs. Talcott, but without emotion. "And where is the pyramidalis alba?" "Well, he's got that up in the flagged garden where she wanted the blue," said Mrs. Talcott. "And it will be so bad for them to move them again. What a pity. They have been sent for especially," Karen explained to Gregory. "My guardian heard of a particularly beautiful kind, and the white were to be for this corner of the wall. You see that they would look very lovely against the sea, and the blue were to be among the white veronica and white lupins in the flagged garden. And now they are all planted wrong, and so accurately and solidly wrong." She walked ahead of Mrs. Talcott, examining the offending plants. "Are you quite sure they're wrong, Mrs. Talcott?" "Dead sure," Mrs. Talcott made reply. "He did it this morning when I was in the dairy. He didn't understand, or got muddled, or something. I'll commence changing them round as soon as I've done this weeding. It'll be a good 2 hours' work." "No, you must not do it till I can help you," said Karen. "To-morrow morning." She had a manner at once deferential and masterful of addressing the old lady. They were friendly without being intimate. "Now promise me that you will wait till I can help you." "Well, I guess I won't promise. I like to get things off my mind right away," said Mrs. Talcott. If Karen was masterful, she was not yielding. I'll see how the time goes after tea. Don't you bother about it." They left her bending over her beds. "She is very strong, but I think sometimes she works too hard," said Karen. By a winding way she led him to the high flagged garden with its encompassing trees and far blue prospect, and here they sat for a little while in the sunlight and talked. "How different all this must be from your home in Northumberland," said Karen. "I have never been to Northumberland. Is your brother much there? Is he like you? Have you brothers and sisters?" She questioned him with the frank interest with which he wished to question her. He told her about Oliver, and said that he wasn't like himself. A faint flavour of irony came into his voice in speaking of his elder brother, and finding Karen's calm eyes dwelling on him, he wondered if she thought him unfair. "We always get on well enough," he said, "but we haven't much in common. He is a good, dull fellow, half alive." "And you are very much alive." "Yes, on the whole, I think so," he answered, smiling, but sensitively aware of a possible hint of irony in her. But she had intended none. She continued to look at him calmly. "You are making use of all of yourself. That is to be alive, Tante always says, and I feel that it is true of you. And his wife, the wife of the dull hunting brother? Does she hunt too and think of foxes most?" He could assure her that Betty quite made up, in the variety of her activities, for Oliver's deficiencies. Karen was interested in the American Betty, and especially in hearing that she had been at the concert from which their own acquaintance dated. She asked him, walking back to the house, if he had seen Mrs. Forrester. "She is an old friend of yours, isn't she?" she said. "That must be nice. She was so kind to me that last day in London. Tante is very fond of her, very, very fond. I hardly think there is any one of all her friends she has more feeling for. Here is Victor, come to greet you. You remember Victor, and how he nearly missed the train." The great benignant dog came down the path to them, and as they walked, Karen laid her hand upon his head, telling Gregory that Sir Alliston had given him to Tante when he was quite a tiny puppy. "You saw Sir Alliston, that sad, gentle poet? There is another person that Tante loves." It was with a slight stir of discomfort that Gregory realized more fully from these assessments how final for Karen was the question of Tante's likes and dislikes. They were on the veranda when she paused. "But I think, though the music room is closed, that you must see the portrait." "The portrait? Of you?" Actually and sincerely he was off the track. "Of me? Oh, no," said Karen, laughing a little. "Why should it be of me? Of my guardian, of course. Perhaps you know it. It is by Sargent, and was in the Royal Academy some years ago." "I must have missed it. Am I to see it now?" "Yes, I will ask Mrs. Talcott for the key, and we will draw all the blinds, and you shall see it." They walked back to the garden in search of Mrs. Talcott. "Do you like it?" Gregory asked. Karen reflected for a moment and then said, "He understands her better than Mr. Drew does, or at all events does not try to make up for what he does not understand by elaborations. But there are blanks. Oh, blanks. However, it is a very magnificent picture, and you shall see. Mrs. Talcott, may I have the key of the music room? I want to show the sergeant to Mr. Jardine." They had come to the old woman again, and again she slowly righted herself from her stooping posture. "It's in my room. I'll come and get it," said Mrs. Talcott, and on Karen's protesting against this, she observed that it was about tea time anyway. She preceded them to the house. "But I do beg," Karen stopped her in the hall. "Let me get it. You shall tell me where it is." Mrs. Talcott yielded. "In my left upper drawer on the right-hand side, under the pile of handkerchiefs," she recited. "Thanks, Karen." While Karen was gone, Mrs. Talcott in the hall stood in front of Gregory and looked past him in silence into the morning room. She did not seem to feel it in any sense incumbent upon her to entertain him, though there was nothing forbidding in her manner. But happening presently, while they waited, to glance at the droll old woman, he found her eyes fixed on him in a singularly piercing, if singularly impassive gaze. She looked away again, with no change of expression, shifting her weight from one hip to the other, and something in the attitude suggested to Gregory that she had spent a great part of her life in waiting. She had a capacity, he inferred, for indefinite waiting. Karen came happily running down the stairs, holding the key. They went into the dim white room, where swathed presences stood as if austerely welcoming them. Karen drew up the blind, and Mrs. Talcott, going to the end of the room, mounted a chair and dexterously twitched from its place the sheet that covered the great portrait. Then, standing beside it, and still holding its covering, she looked, not at it, but meditatively out at the sea that crossed with its horizon line the 4 long windows. Karen, also in silence, came and stood beside Gregory. It was indeed a remarkable picture, white and black, silver and green. To a painter's eye, the arresting balance of these colors would have first appealed, and the defiant charm with which the angular surfaces of the grand piano and the soft curves of the woman seated at it were combined. The most impalpable white of an azalea, with its flame green foliage, and a silver statuette, posed high on a slender column of white chalcedony, were the only accessories. But after the first delighted draught of wonder, it was the face of Madame Okraska, preeminently Madame Okraska in this portrait, that compelled one to concentration. She sat, turning from the piano, her knees crossed, one arm cast over them, the other resting along the edge of the keyboard. The head drooped slightly, and the eyes looked out just below the spectator's eyes, so that in poise and glance it recalled somewhat Michelangelo's Lorenzo de Medici. And something that Gregory had felt in her from the first, and that had roused in him dim hostilities and ironies, was now more fully revealed. The artist seemed to have looked through the soft mask of the woman's flesh, through the disturbing and compelling forces of her consciousness, to the very structure and anatomy of her character. Atavistic, subconscious revelations were in the face. It was to see, in terms of art, a scientific demonstration of race, temperament, and the results of their interplay with environment. The languors, the feverish indolences, the caprice of generations of Spanish exiles were there, and the ambiguity, the fierceness of Slav ancestry. And subtly interwoven were the marks of her public life upon her. The face, so molded to indifference, was yet so aware of observation, so adjusted to it, so insatiable of it, that sitting there absorbed and brooding, lovely with her looped pearls and diamonds, her silver broideries and silken fringes, she was a product of the public, a creature reared on adulation, breathing it in softly, peacefully, as the white flowers beside her breathed in light and air. Her craftsmanship, her genius, though indicated, were submerged in this pervasive quality of an indifference based securely on the ever-present consciousness that none could be indifferent to her, and more than the passive acceptance and security was indicated. Strange, sleeping potentialities lurked in the face, as at the turn of a kaleidoscope. Gregory could fancy it suddenly transformed, by some hostile touch, some menace, to a savage violence and rapacity. He was aware, standing between the girl who worshipped her and the devoted old woman, of the pang of a curious anxiety. "Well," said Karen at last, and she looked from the picture to him, "what do you think of it?" "It's splendid," said Gregory. "It's very fine. And beautiful." "But does it altogether satisfy you?" Her eyes were again on the portrait. "What is lacking I cannot say, but it seems to me that it is painted with intelligence only, not with love. It is Madame Okraska, the great genius, but it is not Tante. It is not even Madame von Marwitz." The portrait seemed to Gregory to go so much further and so much deeper than what he had himself seen, that it was difficult to believe that hers might be the deepest vision. but he was glad to take refuge in the possibility. "It does seem to me wonderfully like," he said. "But then I don't know Tante." Karen now glanced at Mrs. Talcott. "It is a great bone of contention between us," she said, smiling at the old lady, yet smiling, Gregory observed, with a touch of challenge. "She feels it quite complete. That, in someone who does know Tante, I cannot understand." Mrs. Talcott, making no reply, glanced up at the portrait and then again out at the sea. Gregory looked at her with awakened curiosity. This agreement was an unexpected prop for him. "You, too, think it a perfect likeness?" he asked her. Her old blue eyes, old in the antique tranquillity of their regard, yet still of such a vivid unfaded turquoise, turned on him, and again he had that impression of an impassive piercing. "It seems to me about as good a picture as anyone's likely to get," said Mrs. Talcott. "Yes, but oh, Mrs. Talcott!" With controlled impatience Karen took her up. "Surely you see, it isn't Tante. It is a genius, a great woman, a beautiful and poetic creature, of course. He has seen all that. Who wouldn't? But it is almost a woman without a heart. There is something heartless there. I always feel it. And when one thinks of Tante—" And Mrs. Talcott remaining silent, she insisted, "Can you really say you don't see what I mean?" "Well, I never cared much about pictures anyway," Mrs. Talcott now remarked. "Well, but you care for this one more than I do," Karen returned with a laugh of vexation. "It isn't a question of pictures. It's a question of a likeness. You really think that this does Tante justice? It's that I can't understand." Mrs. Talcott, thus pursued, again looked up at the portrait, and continued now to look at it for several moments. And as she stood there, looking up, she suddenly and comically reminded Gregory of the frog gardener before the door in Alice, with his stubborn and deliberate misunderstanding. He could almost have expected to see Mrs. Talcott advance her thumb and rub the portrait, as if to probe the cause of her questioner's persistence. When she finally spoke it was only to vary her former judgment. "It seems to me about as good a picture as Mercedes is likely to get taken," she said. She pronounced the Spanish name Mercedes. Karen, after this, abandoned her attempt to convince Mrs. Talcott. Tea was ready, and they went into the morning room. Here Mrs. Talcott presided at the tea table, and for all his dominating preoccupation she continued to engage a large part of Gregory's attention. She sat, leaning back in her chair, slowly eating, her eyes, like tiny blue stones, immeasurably remote, immeasurably sad, fixed on the sea. "Is it long since you were in America?" he asked her. He felt drawn to Mrs. Talcott. "Well, I guess it's getting on for 25 years now," she replied, after considering for a moment, "since I've lived there. I've been over 3 or 4 times with Mercedes, on tours." 25 years since you came over here? That is a long time." "Oh, it's more than that since I came," said Mrs. Talcott. 25 years since I lived at home. I came over first nearly 50 years ago. Yes, it's a long time." "Dear me, you have lived most of your life here then." "Yes, you may say I have." "And don't you ever want to go back to America to stay?" "I don't know as I do," said Mrs. Talcott. "You're fonder of it over here, like so many of your compatriots?" "Well, I don't know as I am," Mrs. Talcott, who had a genius, it seemed, for non-committal statements, varied. And then, as though aware that her answers might seem ungracious, she added, "All my folks are dead. There's no reason for my wanting to go home that I can think of." "Besides, Mrs. Talcott," Karen now helped her on, "home to you is where Tante is, isn't it? Mrs. Talcott has lived with Tante ever since Tante was born. No one in the world knows her as well as she does. It is rather wonderful to think about." She had the air, finding Mrs. Talcott appreciated, of putting forward for her great claim to distinction. "Yes, I know Mercedes pretty well," Mrs. Talcott conceded. "How I love to hear about it," said Karen. "About her first concert, you know, Mrs. Talcott, when you curled her hair. Such long, bright, brown hair she had, and so thick, falling below her waist, didn't it?" Mrs. Talcott nodded with a certain complacency. "And she wore a little white muslin frock, and white shoes, and a blue sash, and she was only 9 years old. It was a great concert in Warsaw, and she didn't want her hair curled, and combed it all out with her fingers just before going on to the platform, didn't she?" Mrs. Talcott was slightly smiling over these reminiscences. "Smart little thing," she commented. "She did it at the last minute so as it was too late for me to fix it again. It made me feel dreadful her going on to the platform with her head all mussed up like that. She looked mighty pretty all the same." "And she was right, too, wasn't she?" said Karen, elated, evidently, at having so successfully drawn Mrs. Talcott out. "Her hair was never curly, was it? It looked better straight, I'm sure." "Well, I don't know about that," said Mrs. Talcott. "I always liked it curled best, when she was little. But I had to own to myself she looked mighty pretty, though I was so mad at her." "Tante has always had her own way, I imagine," said Karen, "about anything she set her mind on. She had her way about being an infant prodigy, though you were so right about that. She has often said so, hasn't she, and how thankful she is that you were able to stop it before it did her harm. I must show you our photographs of Tante, Mr. Jardine. We have volumes and volumes, and boxes of them. They are far more like her, I think, many of them, than the portrait. Some of them too dear and quaint, when she was quite tiny." Tea was over, and Karen, rising, looked towards the shelves where evidently the volumes and boxes were kept. "I really think I'd rather see more of this lovely place first," said Gregory. "Do take me further along the cliff. I could see the photographs, you know, the next time I come." He, too, had risen, and was smiling at her with a little constraint. Karen, arrested on her way to the photographs, looked at him in surprise. "Will you come again? You are to be in Cornwall so long?" "I'm to be here about a fortnight, and I should like to come often if I may." She was unaware, disconcertingly unaware, yet her surprise showed the frankest pleasure. "How very nice," she said. "I did not think that you could come all that way more than once." While they spoke, Mrs. Talcott's ancient turquoise eyes were upon them, and in her presence Gregory found it easier to say things than it would have been to say them to Karen alone. Already, he felt sure, Mrs. Talcott understood, and if it was easy to say things in her presence, might that not be because he guessed that she sympathized? "But I came down to Cornwall to see you," he said, leaning on his chair back and tilting it a little while he smiled at Karen. Her pleasure rose in a flush to her cheek. "To see me?" "Yes, I felt from our letters that we ought to become great friends." She looked at him, pondering the unlooked-for possibility he put before her. "Great friends?" she repeated. "I have never had a great friend of my own. Friends, of course. The Lippheims and the Bellets and Strepoff and you, of course, Mrs. Talcott, but never really a great friend quite of my own, for they are Tante's friends first and come through Tante. Of course you have come through Tante too," said Karen with evident satisfaction, "only not quite in the same way." "Not at all in the same way," said Gregory. "Don't forget, we met at the concert, and without any introduction. It has nothing to do with Madame von Marwitz this time. It's quite on our own." "Oh, but I would so much rather have it come through her if we are to be great friends," Karen returned, smiling, though reflectively. "I think we are to be, for I felt you to be my friend from that first moment. But it was at the concert that we met, and it was Tante's concert, so that it was not quite on our own. I want it to be through Tante," she went on, "because it pleases me very much to think that we may be great friends, and my happy things have come to me through Tante, always." End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Tante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Adrienne Renee. Tante by Anne Douglas Sedgwick. He came next day and every day. They were favored with the rarely given gift of a perfect spring. They walked along the cliffs and headlands. They sat and talked in the garden. He took her with Mrs. Talcott for long drives to distant parts of the coast, which he and Karen would explore, while Mrs. Talcott in the car sat, with apparently interminable patience, waiting for them. Karen played to him in the morning room, and this was a new revelation of her. She was not a finished performer, and her music was limited by her incapacity. But she had the gift for imparting, with transparent sincerity and unfailing sensitiveness, the very heart of what she played. There were arias from Schubert's sonatas and Bach preludes, and loving little pieces of Schumann that Gregory thought he had never heard so beautifully played before. Everything they had to say was said, though it might be said very softly. He told her that he cared more for her music than for any he had listened to, and Karen laughed, not at all taking him seriously. "But you do care for music, though you are no musician," she said. "I like to play to you, and to someone who does not care it is impossible." Her acceptances of their bond might give ground for all hope or for none. As for himself, there had been, from the moment of seeing her again, of knowing in her presence that fear and that delight, no further doubt as to his own state and its finality. Yet his first perplexities lingered and could at moments become painful. He felt the beloved creature to be at once inappropriate and inevitable. With all that was deepest and most instinctive in him, her nature chimed. The services, the prejudices, the principles of his life she contradicted and confused. She talked to him a great deal in answer to his questions about her past life, and what she told him was often disconcerting. The protective tenderness he had felt for her from the first was troubled by his realization of the books she had placidly read under Tante's guidance, the people whose queer relationships she placidly took for granted as in no need of condonation. When he intimated to her that he disapproved of such contacts and customs, she looked at him, puzzled, and then said, with an air of kindly maturity at once touching and vexatious, "But this is the morality of the Philistines." It was, of course, and Gregory considered it the best of moralities. But remembering her mother, he could not emphasize to her how decisively he held by it. It was in no vulgar or vicious world that her life, as the child of the unconventional sculptor, as the protégé of the great pianist, had been passed. But it was a world without religion, without intuitions, without order. Gregory, though his was not the religious temperament, had his reasoned beliefs in the spiritual realities expressed in intuitions, and he had his inherited instincts of reverence for the rituals that embodied the spiritual life of his race. He was impatient with dissent and with facile skepticisms. He did not expect a woman to have reasoned beliefs, nor did he ask a credulous, uncritical orthodoxy, but he did want the Christian coloring of mind, the Christian outlook. He did want his wife to be a woman who would teach her children to say their prayers at their knees. It was with something like dismay that he gathered from Karen that her conception of life was as untouched by any consciousness of creed as that of a noble young pagan. He was angry at himself for feeling it, and when he found himself applying his rules and measures to her, for what had it been from the first but her spiritual strength and loveliness that had drawn him to her? Yet he longed to make her accept the implications of the formulated faiths that she lived by. "Oh, no, you're not," he said to her when, turning unperturbed eyes upon him, she reassured him. "Oh, yes, I am quite a pagan." "I don't think you know what you mean when you say you're a pagan," Gregory continued. "But yes," she returned, "I have no creed. I was brought up to think of beauty as the only religion. That is my guardian's religion. It is the religion, she says, of all free souls, and my father thought so too." It was again the assurance of a wisdom, not her own, yet possessed by her, a wisdom that she did not dream of anybody challenging. Was it not Tante's? "Well," he remarked, "beauty is a large term. Perhaps it includes more than you think." Karen looked at him with approbation. "This is what Tante says, that it includes everything." And she went on, pleased to reveal to him still more of Tante's treasure, since he had proved himself thus understanding. "Tante, you know, belongs to the Catholic Church. It is the only church of beauty, she says. But she is not pratiquante, not croyante in any sense. Art is her refuge." "I see," said Gregory. "And what is your refuge?" Karen, at this, kept silent for a moment, and then said, "It is not that, not art. I do not feel, perhaps, that I need refuges. And I am happier than my dear guardian. I believe in immortality. Oh, yes, indeed." She looked round gravely at him. They were sitting on the turf of a headland above the sea. "I believe, that is, in everything that is beautiful and loving going on forever." He felt abashed for her, the most dependent and childlike of creatures where her trust and love were engaged. She was as well the most serenely independent. Even Tante, he felt, could not touch her faiths. "You mustn't say that you're a pagan, you see," he said. "But Plato believed in immortality," Karen returned, smiling. "And you will not tell me that Plato was pratiquant or croyant." He did not claim Plato as a member of the Church of England, though he felt quite ready to demonstrate before a competent body of listeners that, as a 19th century Englishman, Plato would have been. Karen was not likely to follow such an argument. She would smile at his seeming sophistries. No, he must accept it, and as a very part of her lovableness, that she could not be made to fit into the plan of his life as he had imagined it. She would not carry on its traditions, for she would not understand them. To win her would be, in a sense, to relinquish something of that orderly progression as a professional and social creature that he had mapped out for himself, though he knew himself to be, through his experience of her, already a creature more human, a creature enriched. Karen, if she came to love him, would be, through love, infinitely malleable, but in the many adjustments that would lie before them, it would be his part to foresee complications and to do the adjusting. Change in her would be a gradual growth, and never towards mere conformity. He felt it to be the first step towards adjustments when he motored Karen and Mrs. Talcott to Gillian's house to lunch with his friends, the Lavingtons. The occasion must mark for him the subtle altering of an old tie. Karen and the Livingstons could never be to each other what he and the Livingstons had been. It was part of her breadth. The congeniality could never, for her, be based on the half-automatic affinities of caste and occupation. and it was part of her narrowness, or rather of her inexperience, that she could see only as individuals and would not recognize the real charm of the Lavingtons, which consisted in their being, like their house and park, part of the landscape and of an established order of things. Yet once he had her there, he watched the metamorphosis that her presence worked in his old associations with pleasure rather than pain. It pleased him intimately that the Lavingtons should see in him a lover as yet uncertain of his chances. It pleased him that they should not find in Karen the type that they must have expected the future Mrs. Jardine to be, the type of Constance Armitage, and the type of Evelyn Lavington, Colonel and Mrs. Lavington's unmarried daughter, who but for Karen might have become Mrs. Jardine one day. He observed with a lover's fond pride that Karen in her shrunken white serge and white straw hat, Karen with her pleasant unperturbability, her mingled simplicity and sophistication, did most decisively make the Lavingtons seem flavorless. Among them, while Mrs. Lavington walked her round the garden and Evelyn elicited with kindly concern that she played neither golf, hockey, nor tennis, and had never ridden to hounds, her demeanor was that of a little rustic princess benignly doing her social duty. The only reason why she did not appear like this to the Lavingtons was that, immutably unimaginative as they were, they knew that she wasn't a princess, was indeed only the odd appendage of an odd celebrity with whom their friend had chosen oddly to fall in love with. They weren't perplexed because since he had fallen in love with her, she was placed. But they, in the complete contrast they offered, had little recognition of individual values and judged a dish by the platter it was served on. A princess was a princess, and an appendage, and a future Mrs. Jardine a very recognizable person, just as, had a subtle Charlotte Russe been brought up to lunch in company with the stewed rhubarb, they would have eaten it without comment and hardly been aware that it wasn't an everyday milk pudding. "Did you and Mrs. Lavington and Evelyn and Mrs. Haverfield find much to talk of after lunch?" Gregory asked, as he motored Mrs. Talcott and Karen back to the Les Solitudes. "Yes, we talked of a good many things," said Karen. "But I know about so few of their things, and they about so few of mine. Miss Lavington was very much surprised to think that I had never been to a fox hunt. And I," Karen smiled, "was very much surprised to think that they had never heard Tante play." "They hardly ever get up to town, you see," said Gregory. "But surely they knew about her?" "Not much," said Karen. "Mrs. Lavington asked me about her, for something pleasant to say, and they were such strange questions, as though one should be asked whether Mr. Arthur Balfour were a Russian nihilist or Metchnikoff an Italian poet." Karen spoke quite without grievance or irony. "And after your sergeant," said Gregory, "you must have been pained by that portrait of Mrs. Haverfield in the drawing-room." "Mrs. Lavington pointed it out to me specially," said Karen, laughing, "and told me that it had been in the academy. What a sad thing, with all those eyelashes! And yet opposite to it hung the beautiful Gainsborough of the great-grandmother. Mrs. Lavington saw no difference, I think." "They hadn't been trained to see differences," said Gregory, and he summed up the Lavingtons in the aphorism to himself as well as to Karen, only to accept sameness. He hoped, indeed, by sacrificing the aesthetic quality of the Lavingtons to win some approbation of their virtues, but Karen, though not inclined to prefer unasked criticism, found evidently no occasion for commendation. Later on, when they were back at the Les Solitudes and walking in the garden, she returned to the subject of his friends and said, "I was a little disturbed about Mrs. Talcott. Did you notice? No one talked to her at all, hardly. It was as if they thought her dame de compagnie. She isn't my dame de compagnie, and if she were, I think that she should have been talked to." Gregory had observed this fact and hoped that it might have escaped Karen's notice. To the Lavingtons, Mrs. Talcott's platter had been unrecognizable, and they had tended to let its contents alone. "It's as I said, you know." He put forward a mitigation. "They've not been trained to see differences. She is very different, isn't she?" "Well, but so am I," said Karen, "and they have talked to me. I don't mean to complain of your friends. That would be very rude, when they were so nice and kind, and besides are your friends. But people's thoughtlessness displeases me. Not that I am often very thoughtless myself." Gregory was anxious to exonerate himself. "I hope she didn't feel left out," he said. "I did notice that she wasn't talking. I found her in the garden, alone. She seemed to be enjoying that, too. And she and I went about for quite a long time together." "I know you did," said Karen. "You are not thoughtless. As for her, one never knows what she feels. I don't think that she does feel things of that sort at all. She has been used to it all her life, one may say. But there's very little she doesn't notice and understand. She understands, oh, perfectly well, that she is a queer old piece of furniture standing in the background, and one has to remember not to treat her like a piece of furniture. It's a part of grace and tact, isn't it? Not to take such obvious things for granted. You didn't take them for granted with her, or with me," said Karen, smiling her recognition at him. "For, of course, to most people I am furniture too. And if Tante is about, there is, of course, nothing to blame in that. Everybody becomes furniture when Tante is there." "Oh, no, I can't agree to that," said Gregory. "Not everybody." "You know what I mean," Karen rejoined. "If you will not agree to it for me, it is because from the first you felt me to be your friend. That is different." They were walking in the flagged garden, where the blue campanulas were now safely established in their places, and the low afternoon sun slanted in among the trees. Karen still wore her hat and monitoring veil, and the smoky gray substance flowed softly back about her shoulders. Her face seemed to emerge from a cloud. It had always, to Gregory's eyes, the air of steadfast advance. The way in which her hair swept back up from her brows gave it a wind-blow, lifted look. He glanced at her now from time to time, while in a meditative and communicative mood she continued to share her reflections with him. Gregory was very happy. "Even Tante doesn't always remember enough about Mrs. Talcott," she went on. "That is, of course, because Mrs. Talcott is so much a part of her life that she sometimes hardly sees her. She is, for her, the dear old restful chair that she sinks back into and forgets about. Besides, some people have a right not to see things. One doesn't ask from giants the same sort of perception that one does from pygmies." This was indeed hard on the Lavingtons, but Gregory was not thinking of the Lavingtons, who took care of themselves. He was wondering, as he more and more wondered, about Madame von Marwitz and what she saw and what she permitted herself not to see. "You aren't invisible to her sometimes?" he inquired. Her innocence before his ironies made him ashamed of always having spoken them. "It is just that makes me feel sometimes so badly about Mrs. Talcott," she answered now. "Just because she is, in a sense, sometimes invisible, and I'm not. Mrs. Talcott, of course, counts for a great deal more in a way of comfort and confidence than I do. I don't believe that Tante really is as intimate with anybody in the world as with Mrs. Talcott, but she doesn't count as much as I do. I am nearly sure in the way of tenderness. I really think in the way of tenderness I am nearer than anybody. They left the flag garden now and came down to a lower terrace. Here the sun shone fully. They walked to and fro in the radiance. Of course, Karen continued to define and confide, as far as interest goes, on any one of her real friends counts for more than I do. And you mustn't think that I mean to say that I believe myself the most loved. Not at all, but I am the tender home thing in her life, the thing to pet and care for and find waiting. It is that is so beautiful for me, and so tragic for her. Why tragic? Oh, but you do not feel it? A woman like that, such a heart and such a spirit, and no one nearer than I am? That she should have no husband and no child? I am a makeshift for all that she has lost or never had. And Mrs. Talcott, said Gregory after a moment. Is it Mrs. Talcott's tragedy to have missed even a makeshift? Karen now turned her eyes on him, and her face, as she scrutinized him, showed a slight severity. Hardly that. She has Tante. Has her as the chair has her, you mean? He couldn't for the life of him control the question. It seemed indeed due to their friendship that he should not conceal from her the fact that he found disproportionate elements in her devotion. Yet it was not the right way in which to be frank, and Karen showed him so in her reply. I mean that Tante is everything to her, and that in the nature of things she cannot be so much to Tante. You mustn't take quite literally what I said of the chair, you know. It can hardly be a makeshift to have somebody like Tante to love and care for. I don't quite know what you mean by speaking like that, Karen said. Her gaze, in meeting his, had become almost stern. She seemed to scan him from a distance. Gregory, though he felt a pang of disquietude, felt no disposition to retreat. He intended that she should be made to understand what he meant. I think that what it comes to is that it is you that I'm thinking of rather than Mrs. Talcott, he said. I don't know your guardian, and I do know you, and it is what she gets rather than what she gives that is most apparent to me. Gets? From me? What may that be? Karen continued to return his gaze almost with haughtiness. The most precious thing I can imagine, said Gregory. Your love. I hope that she is properly grateful for it. She looked at him, and the slow color mounted to her cheeks, but it was as if in unconscious response to his feelings. It hardly even yet signified self-consciousness. She had stood still in asking her last question, and she did not move as she said, I do not like to hear you speak so. It shows me that you understand nothing. Does it? I want to understand everything. You care for me, said Karen, standing still, her eyes on his, and I care for you. But what I most wish in such a friend is that he should see and understand. May I tell you something? Will you wait while I tell you about my life? Please, tell me. I want you to see and understand Tante, said Karen, and how much I love her, and why. They walked on from the terrace to the cliff path. Karen stopped when they had gone a little way and leaned her elbows on the stone wall looking out at the sea. She has been everything to me, she said. Everything. He was aware, as he leaned beside her in the mellow evening light, of a great uneasiness mingling with the beautiful gravity of the moment. She was near him as she had never been near. She had almost recognized his love. It was there between them, and it was as if, not turning from it, she yet pointed to something beyond and above it, something that it was his deep instinct to evade and hers to show him. He must not take a step towards her. she seemed to tell him, until he had proved to her that he had seen what she did. And nothing she could say would, he felt sure of it, alter his fundamental distrust of Madame von Marwitz. "I want to tell you about my life," said Karen, looking out at the sea from between her hands. "You have heard my story, of course. People are always told it, but you have never heard it from my side. You have heard, no doubt, about my father and mother, and how she left the man she did not love for him. My mother died when I was quite little, so though I remember her well, she does not come into the part of my story that I want to tell you. But I was 13 years old when my father died, and that begins the part that leads to Tante. It was in Rome, in winter when he died, and I was alone with him, and there was no money, and I had more to bear than a child's mind and heart should have. He died, and then there were dreadful days. Cold, coarse people came and took me and put me in the convent in Paris. That convent was like hell to me. I was so miserable, and I had never known restraint or unkindness. And the French girls, so sly and so small in their thoughts, were hateful to me, and I did not like the nuns. I was punished and punished, rightly no doubt. I was fierce and sullen, I remember, and would not obey. Then I heard, by chance, from a girl whose family had been to her concert in Paris, that Madame Okraska with her husband at Fontainebleau. Of her I knew nothing but the lovely face in the shop windows, but her husband's name brought back distant days to me. He had known my father. I remembered him, the fair, large, kindly smiling, very sad man, in my father's studio among the clay and marble. He bought once a little head my father had done of me when I was a child. So I ran away from the convent. Oh, it was so very bad. I knocked down a nun and escaped the portress, and hid for a long time in the streets. And I made my way through Paris and walked for a day and night to Fontainebleau. And there in the forest, in the evening, I was lost, and almost dead with hunger and fatigue. And as I stood by the road, I saw the carriage approaching from very far away, and saw sitting in it, as it came nearer, the beautiful woman. Shall I ever forget it? The dark forest and the evening sky above, and her face looking at me, looking, full of pity and wonder. She has told me that I was the most unhappy thing she had ever seen. My father's friend was with her, but though I saw him and knew that I was safe, I had eyes only for her. Her face was like heaven opening. When the carriage stopped, and she leaned to me, I sprang to her, and she put her arms around me. "They have been round me ever since," said Karen, joining her fingers over her eyes and leaning her forehead upon them so that her face was hidden, and for a moment she did not speak. "Ever since," she went on presently, "she has been joy and splendor and beauty. What she has given me is nothing. It is what she is herself that lifts the lives of people. Those who do not know her seem to me to have lives so sad and colorless compared to mine. You cannot imagine it. Anyone so great, yet at the same time so little and so sweet. She is merry like no one else, and witty, and full of cajoleries like a child. One cannot be dull with her, not for one moment. And there is through it all her genius, the great flood of wonderful music. Can you think what it is to live like that? And underlying everything is the great irremediable sorrow. I was with her when it came. The terrible thing, I did not live with them while he was alive, you know. My Uncle Ernst, he was so good and kind, always the kindest of friends to me, but he loved her too deeply to be able to share their life. And how well one understands that in her husband. He had me put in a school in Dresden. I did not like that much either, But even if I were lonely, I knew that my wonderful friends, my Tante and my uncle, were there like the sun behind the gray day, and I tried to study and be dutiful to please them. And in my holidays, I was always with them, twice it was, at their beautiful estate in Germany. And it was there that the horror came that wrecked her life, her husband's death, his death that cannot be explained or understood. He drowned himself. We never say it, but we know it. That is the fear, the mystery. All his joy with her, his love and happiness, to leave them, it was madness. He had always been a sad man. One saw that in his face. The doctors saw it as madness. He disappeared without a word one day. For 3 weeks, nothing. Tante was like a creature crying out on the rack, and it was I who found him by the lake edge one morning. She was walking in the park, I knew. She used to walk and walk fast, fast, quite silent, and with horrible fear I thought, if I can keep her from seeing. I turned, and she was beside me. I could not save her. Ah! Poor woman. Karen closed her hands over her face. They stood for a long time in silence, Gregory leaning beside her and looking down at the sea. His thought was not with the stricken figure she put before him. It dwelt on the girl facing horror, on the child bearing more than a child should bear. Yet he was glad to feel, as a background to his thoughts, that Madame von Marwitz was indeed very pitiful. You understand, said Karen, straightening herself at last and laying her hands on the wall. You see how it is. Yes, said Gregory. It is kind of you and beautiful to feel me as your friend, a person of value, said Karen. But it does not please me to have the great fact of my life belittled. I haven't meant to do that, really. I see why it means so much to you. But I see you before I see the facts of your life. They interest me because of you, said Gregory. You come first to me. It's that I want you to understand. Karen had at last turned her eyes upon his, and they met them in a long encounter that recalled to Gregory their first. It was not the moment for explicit recognitions or avowals. The shadow of the past lay too darkly upon her, but that their relation had changed her deepened gaze accepted. She took his hand. She had a fashion almost boyish of taking his rather than giving her hand, and said, We shall both understand more and more. That is so, is it not? And someday you will know her. Until you know her, you cannot really understand. End of chapter 10. Recording by Adrienne Renee. Chapter 11 of Tante. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Adrienne Renee. Tante by Anne Douglas Sedgwick. Karen and he had walked back to the house in silence, and at the door where she stood to see him off, it had been arranged that he was to lunch at Les Solitudes next day, and that she was to show him a favorite headland, one not far away, but that he had never yet been shown. From the sweetness yet gravity of her look and voice, he could infer nothing but that she recognized change and a new significance. Her manner had neither the confusion nor the pretended unconsciousness of ordinary girlhood. She was calm, but with a new thoughtfulness. He arrived a little early next day and found Mrs. Talcott alone in the morning room writing letters. He noticed as she rose from the bureau her large, immature, considered writing. "Karen'll be down in a minute or two, I guess," she said. "Take a chair." "Don't let me interrupt you," said Gregory, as Mrs. Talcott seated herself before him, her hands folded at her waist. But Mrs. Talcott, remarking briefly, "Don't mention it," did not move back to her former place. She examined him, and he examined her, and he felt that she probed through his composure to his unrest. "I wanted a little talk," she observed presently. "You've gotten pretty fond of Karen, haven't you, Mr. Jardine?" This was to come at once to the point. "Very fond," said Gregory, wondering if she had been diagnosing his fondness in a letter to Madame von Marwitz. "She hasn't got many friends," Mrs. Talcott, after another moment of contemplation, went on. "She's always been a lonesome sort of child." "That's what has struck me too," said Gregory. "Sometimes Mercedes takes her along, but sometimes she don't," Mrs. Talcott pursued. "It ain't a particularly lively sort of life for a young girl, going on in and out of the way place like this with an old woman like me. She's spent most of her time with me when you come to reckon it up." There was no air of criticism or confidence in Mrs. Talcott. She put forward these remarks with unbiased placidity. "I suppose Madame von Marwitz couldn't arrange always to take her?" Gregory asked after a pause. "It ain't always convenient toting a young girl round with you," said Mrs. Talcott. "Sometimes Mercedes feels like it, and sometimes she don't. Karen and I stay at home, now that I'm too old to go about with her, and we see her when she's home. That's the idea. But she ain't much at home. She mostly traveling and staying around with folks." "It isn't a particularly lively time, it seemed to me, for either of you," said Gregory. It was his instinct to blame Madame von Marwitz for the featureless lives led by her dependents, though he could but own that it might, perhaps, be difficult to fit them into the vagabondage of a great pianist's existence. "Well, it's good enough for me," said Mrs. Talcott. "I'm very contented if it comes to that, and so is Karen. She's known so much that's worse, the same as I have, but she's known what's better, too. She was a pretty big girl when her papa died, and she was a companion to him, and I reckon that without figuring it up much to herself, she's lonesome a good deal." Gregory for a moment was silent. Then he found it quite natural to say to Mrs. Talcott, "What I hope is that she will marry me." "I hope so too," said Mrs. Talcott with no alteration of tone. "I hope so the moment I set eyes on you. I saw that you were a good young man and that you'd make her a good, kind husband." "Thanks very much," said Gregory, smiling yet deeply touched. "I hope I may be. I intend to be if she will have me." "The child is mighty fond of you," said Mrs. Talcott. "And it's not as if she's took easy to people. She don't. She's never seemed to need folks. But I can see that she's mighty fond of you. And what I want to say is, even if it don't seem to work out like you want it to right away, you hang on, Mr. Jardine. That's my advice. An old woman like me understands young girls better than they understand themselves. Karen is so wrapped up in Mercedes and thinks such a sight of her that perhaps she'll feel she don't want to leave her. And that sort of thing. But you just hang on." "I intend to," said Gregory. "I can't say how much I thank you for being on my side." "Yes, I am on your side, and I'm on Karen's side. I want to see this thing put through," said Mrs. Talcott. Something seemed to hover between them now, a fourth figure that must be added to the trio they made. He wondered. If he did hang on successfully, and if it did work out as he intended that it should, how that fourth figure would work in. He couldn't see a shared life with Karen from which it could be eliminated, nor did he, of course, wish to see it eliminated. But he did not see himself either as forming one of a band of satellites, and the main fact about the fourth figure seemed to be that any relation to it involved one, apparently in discipleship. There seemed even some disloyalty to Mrs. Talcott in accepting her sympathy while anxieties and repudiations such as these were passing through his mind. For she, no doubt, saw in Karen's relation to Madame von Marwitz the chief asset with which she could present a husband. And he expected Mrs. Talcott now to make some references to this asset. But none came. And if she expected from him some recognition of it, no expectancy was visible in the old blue eyes fixed on his face. A silence fell between them, and as it grew longer, it grew the more consoling. Into their compact of understanding she let him see, he could almost fancy that the question of Madame von Marwitz was not to enter, with which she could present a husband, and he expected Mrs. Talcott now to make some references to this asset, but none came. A silence fell between them, and as it grew longer, it grew the more consoling. Into their compact of understanding she let him see, he could almost fancy that the question of Madame von Marwitz was not to enter. Karen, when she appeared, was looking preoccupied. And after shaking his hand and giving him for a moment the sweet, grave smile with which they had parted, she glanced at the writing table. "You're writing to Tante, Mrs. Talcott?" she said. "You heard from her this morning?" "Yes, I heard from her," said Mrs. Talcott. Gregory at once inferred that Madame von Marwitz had been writing for information concerning himself. She must by now have become aware of his correspondence with Karen and its significant continuity. "Are there any messages? Any news?" asked Karen, and she could not keep dejection from her voice. She had had no letter. "It's only a business note," said Mrs. Talcott. "Hasn't Miss Scrotton written?" "Does my cousin keep you posted as a rule?" Gregory asked, as Karen shook her head. "No, but Tante asks her to write sometimes, when she is too tired or rushed, and I had a letter from her giving me their plans only a few days ago, so I know that all is well. It is only that I am always greedy for Tante's letters, and this is the day on which they often come." They went in to lunch. Karen spoke little during the meal. Gregory and Mrs. Talcott carried on a desultory conversation about hotels and the different merits of different countries in this respect. Mrs. Talcott had a vast experience of hotels, from Germany to Australia, from New York to St. Petersburg. They were known to her. After lunch, he and Karen started on their walk. It had been a morning of white fog, and the mist still lay thickly over the sea, so that from the high cliff path, a clear, pale sky above them, they looked down into milky gulfs of space. Then, as the sun shone softly and a gentle breeze arose, a rift of dark, still blue appeared below, as the sky appeared behind dissolving clouds, and fold upon fold, slumberlessly, the mist rolled back upon itself. The sea lay like a floor of polished sapphire beneath the thick, soft webs. Far below, in a cavern, the sound of lapping water clucked, and a seagull, indolently intent, drifted by slowly on dazzling wings. Karen and Gregory reached their headland and, seating themselves on the short, warm turf, looked out over the sea. During the walk they had hardly spoken, and he had wondered whether her thoughts were with him and with their last words yesterday, or dwelling still on her disappointment. But presently, as if her preoccupation had drifted from her as the fog had drifted from the sea, Karen turned tranquil eyes upon him and said, "I suddenly thought, and the stillness made me think of it, and Mrs. Talcott's hotels too, perhaps, of all that is going on in the world while we sit here so lonely and so peaceful. Frenchmen with fat cheeks and flat-brimmed silk hats sitting at little tin tables in boulevards. Isn't it difficult to realize that they exist? And Arabs on camels crossing deserts. they are quite imaginable. And nuns praying in convent cells, and stokers, all stripped and sweating under the engines of great steamers, and a little Japanese artist carving so carefully the soles of the feet of some tiny image. There they are, all going on, as real to themselves as we are, at the very moment that we sit here and feel that only we, in all the world, are real. She might also have been confiding her fancies to a husband whose sympathy had been tested by years of fond companionship. Gregory, wondering at her, loving her, pulled at the short turf as she lay, propped on an elbow, beside her, and said, "What nice thoughts you have." "You have them too, I think," said Karen, smiling down at him. "And nicer ones. Mine are usually only amusing, like those, but yours are often beautiful. I see that in your face, you know. It is a face that makes me think always of a cold, clear, steely pond. That is what it looks like if one does not look down into it, but only across it, as it were. But if one bends over and looks down, deep down, one sees the sky and passing white clouds and boughs of trees. I saw deep down at once. That is why," her eyes rested upon him, "we were friends from the first." "Ah, but you think them for yourself, too. When you are alone, you think them." "But when I am alone, I think them. Without you in the thought of them, it's always with sadness for something I've lost. You bring them back with happiness. The thought of you is always happy. I have never known anyone who seems to me so peacefully happy as you." "You're very happy, aren't you?" Gregory looked down at his little tufts of turf as he asked this question. "I am glad I seem to you like that," said Karen. "I think I am usually quiet and gay and full of confidence. I sometimes wonder at my confidence, but it is not always so. No, I am not always happy. Sometimes, when I think and remember, it is like feeling a great hole being dug in my heart, as if the iron went down and turned up dark, forgotten things. I have that feeling sometimes, and then I wonder that I can ever be happy." "What things, dear Karen?" "You know, I think." Karen looked out at the sea. "Tante's face when I found her husband's body, and my father's face when he was dying. He did not know what was to become of me. He was quite weak, like a little child, and he cried on my breast. And my mother's face when she died. I have not told you anything of my mother. Will you? I want to hear everything about you." "Everything," said Gregory. "This is her locket," Karen said, putting her hand over it. "Her face is in it. Would you like to see it?" He held out his hand, and slipping the ribbon over her head, she pressed the little spring and laid the open locket in it. He saw the tinted photograph of a young girl's head, a girl younger than Karen, and with her fair hair and straight brows and square chin. But it was a gentler face, and a clumsier and strange with its alien nationality. "I always feel as if she were my child and I her mother when I look at that," said Karen. "It was taken before I was born. She had a happy life, and yet my memory of her breaks my heart. She was so very young, and it frightened her so much to die. She couldn't bear to leave us." Gregory, holding the little locket, looked at it silently. Then he put it to his lips. "You care for me, don't you, Karen?" he said. "You know, I think," said Karen, repeating her former words. He laid the locket in her hand, and the moment had for him a sacramental holiness, so that the locket was like a little wedding ring. Holding it and her hand together, he said, lifting his eyes to hers, "I love you. Do you love me?" Her eyes had filled with tears when he had kissed her mother's face, and there was a young awe in her gaze, but no shadow, no surprise. "Yes," she said unhesitatingly. "Yes, I love you, dear Gregory." The simplicity, the inevitableness of his bliss overwhelmed him. He held her hand and looked down at it. All about them was the blue. All her past, its beauty, its dark, forgotten thing she had given to him. She was his forever. "Oh, my darling Karen," he murmured. She bent down to look at him now, smiling and unclosing her hand from his gently so that she could look at her mother's face. "How glad she would be if she could now," she said. "Perhaps she does know. Do you not think so?" "Dear, I don't know what I think about those hopes. I hope." "Oh, it is more than hope. My belief that she is there, that she is not lost. Only one cannot tell how or when or where it all may be. For that, yes, it can only be hope. She, too, would love you, I'm sure," Karen continued. "Would she? I'm glad you think so, darling. We are so much alike, you see, that it is natural to feel that we should think alike. Do you not think that her face is much like mine? What happiness! I'm glad it is not a day of rain for our happiness." And then she added, "I hope we may be married." "Why, we are to be married, dear child," Gregory said, smiling at her. "There is no may about it, since you love me." "Only one," said Karen, who still looked at her mother's face. "And perhaps it would be well not to speak much of our love till we can know. But I feel sure that she will say this happiness is for me." "She?" Gregory repeated. For a moment, he imagined that she meant some superstition connected with her mother. Karen, slipping the ribbon over her head, had returned the locket to its place. "Yes, Tante," she said, still with the locket in her hand. "Tante?" Gregory repeated. At his tone, its change, she lifted startled eyes to his. "What has she to do with it?" Gregory asked for a moment in which she continued to gaze at him. "What has Tante to do with it?" said Karen in a wondering voice. "Do you think I could marry without Tante's consent?" "But you love me." "I do not understand you. Was it wrong of me to have said so before I had her consent? Was that not right, not fair to you?" "Since you love me, you ought to be willing to marry me whether you have your guardian's consent or not." His voice strove to control its bitterness, but the day had darkened. All his happiness was blurred. He felt as if a great injury had been done to him. Karen continued to gaze at him in astonishment. "Would you have expected me to marry you without my mother's consent? She is in my mother's place. If you loved me, I should certainly expect you to say that you would marry me whether your mother consented or not. You are of the age. There is nothing against me. Those aren't English ideas at all, Karen." "But I am not English," said Karen. "My guardian is not English. They are our ideas." You seriously mean that, loving me, you would give me up if she told you so?" "Yes," said Karen, now with the heaviness of their recognized division. "She would not refuse her consent unless it were right that I should give you up." For some moments after this, Gregory, in silence, looked down at the grass between them, clasping his knees, for he now sat upright. Then, controlling his anger to argumentative rationality, he said, while again wrenching away at the strongly rooted tufts, "If she did refuse, what reason could she give for refusing? As I say, there's absolutely nothing against me." Karen had kept her troubled eyes on his downcast face. "There might be things she did not like, things she would not believe for my happiness in married life," she replied. "And you would take her word against mine?" "You forget, I think." He had lifted his eyes to hers, and she looked back at him steadily, with no entreaty, but with all the perplexity of her deep pain. "She has known me for 11 years. I have only known you for 3 months." He could not now control the bitterness or the dismay, for coldly cuttingly he knew it. It was quite possible that Madame von Marwitz would not like things in him. Their one encounter had not been of a nature to endear him to her. "It simply means," he said, looking into her eyes, "that you haven't any conception of what love is. It means that you do not love me." They looked at each other for the moment, and then Karen said, "That is hard." And after another moment, she rose to her feet. Gregory got up and they went down the cliff pass towards Les Solitudes. He had not spoken recklessly. His words expressed his sense of her remoteness. He could not imagine what sort of love it was that could be so composedly put aside. And making no feminine appeal or protest, she walked steadily, in silence, before him. Only at a turning of the way did he see that her lips were compressed and tears upon her cheeks. "Karen," he said, looking into her face, and he now walked beside her, "won't you talk it over? You astonish me so unspeakably. Can she destroy our friendship, too? Would you give me up as a friend if she didn't like things in me?" The tears expressed no yielding, for she answered, "Yes." "And how far do you push submission? If she told you to marry someone she chose for you, would you consent, whether you loved him or not?" "It is not submission," said Karen. "It is our love, hers and mine. She would not wish me to marry a man I did not love. The contrary is true. My guardian, before she went away, spoke to me of a young man she had chosen for me, someone for whom she had the highest regard and affection, and I too am very fond of him. She felt that it would be for my happiness to marry him, and she hoped that I would consent. But I did not love him. I told her that I could never love him, and so it ended immediately. You do her injustice in your thoughts of her, and you do injustice to me if you think of me as a person who would marry where I did not love." He walked beside her, bitterly revolving the sorry comfort of this last speech. "Who was this young man?" he asked. Not that he really cared to know. "His name is Herr Franz Lefebvre," said Karen gravely. "He is a young musician." "Herr Franz Lefebvre," Gregory repeated, with an irritation glad to wreak itself of this sudden object presented opportunely. "How could you have been imagined as marrying someone called Lefebvre?" "Why not? Pray?" "Is he a German Jew?" Gregory inquired for a moment. "He is, indeed, of Joachim's nationality," Karen answered in a voice from which the tears were gone. They walked on, side by side, the estrangement cutting deep between their new-won nearness. Yet, in the estrangement was an intimacy deeper than that of the merely blissful state. They seemed, in the last miserable half-hour, to have advanced by years their knowledge of each other. Mrs. Talcott and tea were waiting for them in the morning room. The old woman fixed her eyes upon each face in turn and then gave her attention to her teapot. "I'm sorry, Miss Talcott, that we are so late," Karen said. Her composure was kept only by an effort that gave to her tones a stately conventionality. "Don't mention it," said Mrs. Talcott. "I am only just in myself." "Had it not been a beautiful afternoon?" Karen continued. "What have you been doing in the garden, Mrs. Talcott?" "I sewed a big bed of mignonette down by the arbor, and Mitchell and I set out a good lot of plants." Mrs. Talcott made her replies to the questions that Karen continued to ask in an even voice in which Gregory, who kept his dismal eyes upon her, detected a melancholy patience. Mrs. Talcott must perceive his state to be already one of hanging on. Of her sympathy he was, at all events, assured. She showed it by rising as soon as he and Karen had drunk their tea. "I've got some more things to do," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Jardine. Are you coming over tomorrow?" "No," said Gregory, taking Mrs. Talcott's hand. "My holiday is over. I shall be going back to town tomorrow." Mrs. Talcott looked into his eyes. "Well, that's too bad," she observed. "Isn't it? I'd far rather stay here, I can assure you," said Gregory. "We'll miss you, I guess," said Mrs. Talcott. "I'm very glad to have had the pleasure of making your acquaintance." "And I of making yours." Mrs. Talcott departed and Gregory turned to Karen. She was standing near the window, looking at him. "We must say goodbye too, I suppose," said Gregory, mastering his grief. "You will give me your guardian's address so that I can write her at once?" Her face had worn the aspect of a gray, passive sheet of water. A radiant pallor now seemed struck from its dulled surface. "You are going to write to Tante?" she said. "Isn't that the next step?" Gregory asked. "You will write too, won't you? Or is it part of my ordeal that I'm to plead my cause alone?" Karen had clasped her hands together on her breast, and in the eyes fixed on his, tears gathered. "Do not speak harshly," she said. "I am so sorry there must be the ordeal, but so happy too, so suddenly. Because I believed that you were going to leave me since you thought me so wrong and so unloving." "Going to leave you, Karen?" Gregory repeated in amazement. Desperate amusement struggled in his face with self-reproach. "My darling child, what must you think of me? And actually, you'd have let me go?" He had come to her and taken her hands in his. "What else could I do?" "Such an idiot would have deserved it. Could you believe me such an idiot?" "Darling, you so astonish me. What a strange, indomitable creature you are." "What else could I do, Gregory?" she repeated, looking into his face and not smiling in answer to his smiling, frowning gaze. "Love me more. That's what you could have done. A great deal more," said Gregory. "That's what you must do, Karen. I can't bear to think that you wouldn't marry me without her consent. I can't bear to think that you don't love me enough. But leave you because you don't love me as much as I want you to love me? My darling, how little you understand." "You seemed very angry," said Karen. "I was so unhappy. I don't know how I should have borne it if you had gone away and left me like this." "But love should not make one weak, Gregory. There you are wrong, to think it is because I do not love you." "Ah, you'll find out if I'm wrong," Gregory exclaimed with tender conviction. "You'll find out how much more you are to love me." "Oh, yes, I will kiss you goodbye, Karen. I don't care if all the Tantes in the world forbid it." In thinking afterwards of these last moments that they had together, the discomfitures and dismays of the afternoon tended to resolve themselves for Gregory into the memory of the final yielding. She had let him take her into his arms, and with the joy was the added sweetness of knowing that in permitting and reciprocating his unauthorized kiss, she sacrificed some principles, at all events, for his sake. End of chapter 11. Recording by Adrienne Renee.
Chapter 12 of Tante. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Christoph. Tante by Anne Douglas Sedgwick. Chapter 12. Madame von Marwitz was sitting on the great terrace of a country house in Massachusetts, opening and reading her Post, as we have already seen her do. Impatient and weary as the occupation often made her, she yet depended upon the morning waves of adulation that lapped in upon her from every quarter of the earth. To miss the fullness of the tide gave her, when by chance there was deficiency, the feeling that badly made café au lait gave her at the beginning of the day. Something was wrong. The expected stimulant lacked in force or in flavour, and coffee that was not strong and sweet and aromatic was a mishap so unusual that, when it occurred, it became an offence almost gross and unnatural, as did a post that brought few letters of homage and depreciation. Today the mental coffee was as strong and as perfumed as that of which she had shortly before partaken in her lovely little Louis Quinze boudoir, after she had come in from her bath. The bathroom was like that of a Roman empress, all white marble, and a square of emerald water into which one descended down shallow marble steps. Madame von Marwitz was amused by the complexities of luxury among which she found herself, some of which, even to her, were novel. Ma chère, she had said to Miss Scrotton. Beautiful if you will, and very beautiful. But its nails are too much polished, its hair too much ondulé. I prefer a porcelain to a marble bathtub. But the ingenuities of hospitality which the Aspreys, earnest and accomplished millionaires, lavished upon their guests made one, she owned, balmily comfortable. And as she sat now in her soft white draperies under a great silken sunshade raised on a stand above her and looking in the sunlight like a silver bell, the beauty of her surroundings, the splendid Italian gardens, a miracle of achievement even if lacking, as the miraculous may, an obvious relation with its surroundings. The landscape with its inlaid lake and wood and hill and great arch of bluest sky, the tall, transparent, Turner-esque trees in the middle distance, all this stately serenity seemed to have wrought in her an answering suavity and gladness. There was almost a latent gaiety in her glance, as, with her large, white, securely moving hands, which seemed to express their potential genius in every deft and delicate gesture, she took up and cut open and unfolded her letters, pausing between them now and then to tweak off and eat a grape as large as a plum from the bunch lying on its leaves in the Veronese-like silver platter beside her. This suavity, this gladness and even gaiety of demeanour were apparent to Miss Eleanor Scrotton, when she presently emerged from the house and advanced slowly along the terrace, pausing at intervals beside its balustrade to gaze with a somewhat melancholy eye over the prospect. Miss Scrotton was struggling with a half-formulated sense of grievance. It was she who had brought Madame von Marwitz and the Aspreys together. Madame von Marwitz already knew, of course, most of the people in America who were worth knowing. If she hadn't met them there, she had met them in Europe. But the Aspreys she had, till then, never met, and they had been, indisputably, Miss Scrotton's possession. Miss Scrotton had known them slightly for several years. Her father and Mr. Asprey had corresponded on some sociological theme, and the Aspreys had called on him in London in a mood of proper deference and awe. She had written to the Aspreys before sailing with Mercedes, had found that they were wintering in Egypt, but would be back in America in spring, ready to receive Madame von Marwitz and herself with open arms, and within those arms she had, a week ago, placed her treasure. No doubt someone else would have done it if she hadn't, and perhaps she had been too eager in her determination that no one else should do it. Perhaps she was altogether a little too eager. Madame von Marwitz liked people to care for her, and showed a pretty gratitude for pains endured on her behalf. At least, she usually did so. But it may well have been that the great woman, at once vaguely aloof and ironically observant, had become a little too irked, or bored, or merely amused at hearing so continually, as it were, her good Scrotton panting beside her, tense, determined and watchful of opportunity. However that may have been, Miss Scrotton, as Madame von Marwitz's glance now lifted and rested upon herself, detected the sharper gaiety defined by the French's malice, lighting, though ever so mildly, her friend's eyes and lips. Like most devotees, Miss Scrotton had something of the valet in her composition, and with the valet's capacity for obsequiousness went a valet-like shrewdness of perception. She hadn't spent 4 months travelling about America with Madame von Marwitz without seeing her in undress. She had long since been uncomfortably aware that when Madame von Marwitz found one a little ridiculous, she should be unkind, and that when one added plaintiveness to folly, she often amused herself by giving one, to speak metaphorically, soft yet sharp little pinches that left one nervously uncertain of whether a caress or an aggression had been intended. Miss Scrotton was plaintive, and she could not conceal it. Glory as she might in the role of second fiddle, she was very tenaciously aware of what was due to that subservient but by no means insignificant performer, and the Aspreys had not shown themselves enough aware, Mercedes had not shown herself aware at all, of what they all owed to her sustaining, discreet and harmonious accompaniment. In the carefully selected party, assembled at Bellevue for Madame von Marwitz's delectation, she had been made a little to feel that she was but one of the indistinguishable orchestra that plucked out from accommodating strings a mellow bass to the one thrilling solo. Not for one moment did she grudge any of the recognitions that were her great friend's due, but she did expect to bask beside her. She did expect to find transmitted to her an important satellite's share of beams, and it wasn't to be denied. Mercedes had been too much occupied with other people, and with one other in particular, to shine upon her in any distinguishing degree. Mercedes had the faculty, chafe against it as one might, and her very fondness, her very familiarity were a part of the effect, of making one show as unimportant satellite, as something that would revolve when wanted, and be contentedly invisible when that was fitting. "I might almost as well be a paid dame de compagnie," Miss Scrotton had more than once murmured to herself, with a lip that trembled, and, obscurely, she realized that close association with the great might reveal one as insignificant rather than as glorified. It was therefore with her air of melancholy that she paused in her advance along the terrace to gaze out at the prospect, and with an air of emphasized calm and dignity that she finally came towards her friend, and as she came, thus armed, the blitheness deepened in the great woman's eyes. "Well, ma chérie," she remarked, "how goes it?" She spoke in French. "Very well, mon bien ami," Miss Scrotton replied, in the same language. Her French was correct, but Mercedes often made playful sallies at the expense of her accent. She preferred not to talk in French, and when Madame von Marwitz went on to ask her where her fellow convives were, it was in English that she answered, "I don't know where they all are. I have been busy writing letters. Mrs. Asprey and Lady Rose are driving, I know, and Mr. Asprey and Mr. Drew I saw in the smoking room as I passed. The Marquise I don't think is down yet, nor Mrs. Furnival. The young people are playing tennis, I suppose." Miss Scrotton looked about the terrace with its rhythmic tubs of flowering trees, its groups of chairs, its white silk parasols, and then wandered to the parapet to turn and glance up at the splendid copy of an Italian villa that rose above it. "It is really very beautiful, Mercedes," she observed. "It becomes the more significant from being so isolated, so divorced from what we are accustomed to find in Europe as a setting for such a place, doesn't it? Just as, I always think, the people of the Asprey type, the best this country has to offer, are more significant, too, for being picked out from so much that is indistinguishable. I do flatter myself, darling, that in this visit at least I've been able to offer you something really worth your while, something that adds to your experience of people and places. You are enjoying yourself," said Miss Scrotton with a manner of sad satisfaction. "Yes, truly," Madame von Marwitz made genial reply. "The more so for finding myself surrounded by so many old acquaintances. It is a particular pleasure to see again Lady Rose and the vivacious and intelligent Mrs. Furnival. It was in Venice that we last met. Her palazzo there you must one day see. Monsieur de Hautefeuille and Mr. Drew are counted already as friends in Europe. And Mrs. Asprey, you will soon count as one, I hope. She is really a somewhat remarkable woman. She comes, you know, of one of their best and oldest families." "Oh, for that, no, not remarkable. Good, if you will, bon comme du pain. It strikes me much that goodness, among these American rich whom we are accustomed to hear so crudely caricatured in Europe, it is quite a respectable little aristocracy. They ally themselves, as we see here in our excellent host and hostess, with what there is of old blood in the country and Wynn tradition to guide their power. They are not the flaunting, vulgar rich, of whom we hear so much from those who do not know them, but the anxious, thoughtful, virtuous rich, oppressed by their responsibilities, and all studying so hard, poor dears, at stiff, deep books, in order to fulfill them worthily. They all go to the conferences, these ladies, it seems, to study sociology. They take life with a seriousness that I have never seen equalled. Mrs. Asprey is like them all. Good, all but yes, and I am pleased to know her too. Mrs. Furnival has promised her long since, she tells me, that it should be. She and Mrs. Furnival are old schoolmates." Miss Scrotton, all her merit thus mildly withdrawn from her, stood silent for some moments, looking away at the lake and the Turneresque trees. "It was so very kind of you, Mercedes, to have had Mr. Drew asked here," she observed at last, very casually. "It is a real opportunity for a young bohemian of that type. You are a true fairy godmother to him. First Mrs. Forrester, and now the Aspreys. Curious, wasn't it, his appearing over here so suddenly?" "Curious? It did not strike me so," said Madame von Marwitz, showing no consciousness of the thrust her friend had ventured to essay. "People come to America a great deal, do they not? And often suddenly. It is the country of suddenness. His books are much read here, it seems, and he had business with the publishers. He knew, too, that I was here, and that to him was also an attraction. Why curious, my Scrotton?" Miss Scrotton disliked intensely being called my Scrotton, but she had never yet found the necessary courage to protest against the appellation. "Oh, only because I had no hint of it until he appeared," she returned. "And I wondered if you had had. Yes, I suppose he would be a good deal read over here. It is a very derivative and artificial talent, don't you think, darling?" "Rather derivative, rather artificial," Madame von Marwitz replied serenely. "He doesn't look well, does he?" Miss Scrotton pursued, after a little pause. "I don't like that puffiness about the eyelids and chin. It will be fatal for him to become fat." "No," said Madame von Marwitz, as serenely as before, her eyes now on a letter that she held. "Ah, no. He could rise above fat, that young man. I can see him fat with impunity. Would it become, then, somewhat the Talleyrand type? How many distinguished men have been fat? Napoleon, Renan, Gibbon, Dr. Johnson." She turned her sheet as she mildly brought out the desultory list. "And all seem to end in N, do they not? I am glad that I asked Mr. Drew. He flavours the dish like an aromatic herb, and what a success he has been, hein? But he is the type of personal success. He is independent, indifferent, individual." "Ah, my dear, you are too generous to that young man," Miss Scrotton mused. "It's beautiful, it's wonderful to watch, but you are indeed too kind to him." She mused. She was absent, yet she knew, and knew that Mercedes knew, that never before in all their intercourse had she ventured on such a speech. It implied watchfulness, it implied criticism, it implied even anxiety, it implied all manner of things that it was not permitted for a satellite to say. The Baroness's eyes were on the letter, and though she did not raise them, her dark brows lifted. "Tiens," she continued, "you find that I am too kind to him?" Miss Scrotton, to keep up the appearance of ingenuousness, was forced to further definition. "I don't think, darling, that in your sympathy, your solitude, where young talent is concerned, you quite realize how much you give, how much you can be made use of. The man admires you, of course, and has, of course, talent of a sort. Yet when I see you together, I confess that I receive sometimes the impression of a scattering of pearls." Madame von Marwitz laid down her letter. "Aha! Oh, ma bonne!" she said. She laughed out. Her eyes were lit with dancing sparks. "Do you know you speak as if you were very, very jealous of this young man who is found so charming?" "Jealous, my dear Mercedes?" Miss Scrotton's emotion showed itself in a dark flush. Mais oui, mais oui. You tell me that my friend is a swine. Does that not mean that you, of late, have received too few pearls?" "My dear Mercedes, who called him a swine?" "One does not speak of scattered pearls without rousing these associations." Her tone was beaming. Was it possible to swallow such an affront? Was it possible not to? And she had brought it upon herself. There was comfort and a certain restoration of dignity in this thought. Miss Scrotton, struggling inwardly, feigned lightness. "So few of us are worthy of your pearls, dear. Unworthiness doesn't, I hope, consign us to the porcine category. Perhaps it is that being, like him, a little person, I am able to see Mr. Drew's merits and demerits more impartially than you do. That is all. I really ought to know a good deal about Mr. Drew," Miss Scrotton pursued, regaining more self-control, now that she had steered her way out of the dreadful shoals where her friend's words had threatened to sink her. "I've known him since the days when he was at Oxford, and I used to stay there with my uncle the Dean. He was sitting then at the feet of Pater. It's a derivative, a parvenu talent, and I do feel it. I confess I do. A derivative personality altogether, like that of so many of these clever young men nowadays. He is, you know, of anything but distinguished antecedents, and his reaction from his own milieu has been, perhaps, from the first, a little marked. Unfortunately, his marriage is there to remind people of it, and I never see Mr. Drew dans le monde without, irrepressibly, thinking of the dismal little wife in Surbiton whom I once called upon, and his swarms, but swarms, my dear, of large-mouthed children." Miss Scrotton wondered, as she proceeded, whether she had again too far abandoned discretion. The Baroness examined her next letter for a moment before opening it, and, if she, too, had received her sting, she abandoned nothing. She answered with complete, though perhaps ominous, mildness. "He is rather like Shelley, I always think. A sophisticated Shelley who had sat at the feet of Pater. Shelley, too, had swarms of children, and it is possible that they were large-mouthed. The plebeian origin that you tell me of rather attracts me. I care especially for the fine flame that mounts from darkness, and I too, on one side, as you will remember, ma bonne, am du peuple. My dear Mercedes, your father was an artist, a man of genius, and if your parents had risen from the gutter, you, by your own genius, transcended the question of rank as completely as a Shakespeare." The continued mildness was alarming Miss Scrotton. An eagerness to make amends was in her eye. "Ah, but did he, poor man?" Madame von Marwitz mused, rather irrelevantly, her eyes on her letter. "One hears now not, but thank you, my Scrotton. You mean to be consoling. I have, however, no dread of the gutter, tiens." She turned to a page. "Here is news indeed." Miss Scrotton had now taken a chair beside her, and her fingers tapped a little impatiently as the Baroness's eye, far from the thought of pearls and swine, went over the letter. "Tiens, tiens," Madame von Marwitz repeated. "The little Karen is sought in marriage." "Really?" said Miss Scrotton. "How very fortunate for the poor little thing. Who is the young man, and how in heaven's name has she secured a young man in the wilds of Cornwall?" Madame von Marwitz made no reply. She was absorbed in another letter, and Miss Scrotton now perceived with amazement and indignation that the one laid down was written in the hand of Gregory Jardine. "You don't mean to tell me," Miss Scrotton said, after some moments of hardly held patience, "that it's Gregory?" Madame von Marwitz, having finished her second letter, was gazing before her with a somewhat ambiguous expression. "Tally speaks well of him," she remarked at last. "He has made a very good impression on Tally." "Are you speaking of Gregory Jardine, Mercedes?" Miss Scrotton repeated. Madame von Marwitz now looked at her, and as she looked, the tricksy light of malice again grew in her eye. Mais oui. You have guessed correctly, my Scrotton," she said, "and you may read his letter. It is pleasant to me to see that stiff, self-satisfied young man brought to his knees. Read it, ma chère, read it. It is an excellent letter." Miss Scrotton read, and while she read, Madame von Marwitz's cold, deep eyes rested on her, still vaguely smiling. "How very extraordinary," said Miss Scrotton. She handed back the letter. "Extraordinary? Now, why, ma bonne?" her friend inquired, all limpid frankness. "Extraordinary? Now, why, ma bonne?" her friend inquired, all limpid frankness. "He looked indeed a stockish, chill young man of the cold-nosed type. Ah, que je n'aime pas ça. But he is a good young man, a most unimpeachable young man, and how little Karen has melted him, how much his letter shows." "Gregory Jardine is a very able and very distinguished person," said Miss Scrotton, "and of an excellent county family. His mother and mine were cousins, as you know, and I have always taken the greatest interest in him. One can't but wonder how the child managed it." Mercedes, she knew, was drawing a peculiar satisfaction from her displeasure, but she couldn't control it. "Ah, the child is not a manager. She is so far from managing it, you see, that she leaves it to me to manage. It touches and surprises me, I confess, to find that her devotion to me rules her even at a moment like this. Yes, Karen has pleased me very much." "Of course that old-fashioned formality would indeed charm Gregory. It is very conventional, but I do hope, my dear Mercedes, that you will think it over a little before giving your consent. It is really a most unsuitable match. Karen's feelings are evidently not at all deeply engaged, and with Gregory it must be a momentary infatuation. He will get over it in time and thank you for saving him, and Karen will marry Herr Lippheim, as you hoped she would." "Now, upon my word, my Scrotton," said Madame von Marwitz, in a manner as near insolence as its grace permitted, "I do not follow you. A barrister, a dingy little London barrister, to marry my ward? You call that an unsuitable marriage? I protest that I do not follow you, and I assert to the contrary that he has played his cards well. Who is he? A nobody. You speak of your county families. What do they signify outside their county? Karen in herself is, I grant you, also a nobody, but she stands to me in a relation almost filial, if I choose to call it so, and I signify more than the families of many counties put together. Let us be frank. He opens no doors to Karen. She opens doors to him." Miss Scrotton, addressed in these measured and determined tones, changed colour. "My dear Mercedes, of course you are right there. Of course, in one sense, if you take Gregory in as you have taken Karen in, you open doors to him. I only meant that a young man in his position, with his way to make in the world, ought to marry some well-born woman with a little money. He must have money if he is to get on. He ought to be in Parliament one day, and Karen is without a penny. You have often told me so, as well as illegitimate. Of course, if you intend to make her a large allowance, that is a different matter. But can you really afford to do that, darling?" "I consider your young man very fortunate to get Karen without one penny," Madame von Marwitz pursued, in the same measured tones, "and I shall certainly make him no present of my hard-earned money. Let him earn the money for Karen now, as I have done for so many years. Had she married my good Franz, it would have been a very different thing. This young man is well able to support her in comfort. No, it all comes most opportunely. I wanted Karen to settle, and to settle soon. I shall cable my consent and my blessings to them at once. Will you kindly find me a servant, ma chère?" Miss Scrotton, as she rose automatically to carry out this request, was feeling that it is possible almost to hate one's idols. So she had transgressed, and she knew it, and Mercedes had been aware of what she had done, and had punished her for it. She even wondered if the quick determination to accept Gregory as Karen's suitor hadn't been part of the punishment. Mercedes knew that she had a pride in her cousin, and had determined to humble it. She had perhaps herself to thank for having riveted this most disastrous match upon him. It was with a bitter heart that she walked on into the house. As she went in, Mr. Claude Drew came out, and Miss Scrotton gave him a chill greeting. She certainly hated Mr. Claude Drew. Claude Drew blinked a little in the bright sunlight, and had somewhat the air of a graceful, nocturnal bird emerging into the day. He was dressed with an appropriateness to the circumstances of stately villégiature, so exquisite as to have a touch of the fantastic. Madame von Marwitz sat with her back to him in the limpid shadow of the great white parasol, and was again looking, not at Karen's, but at Gregory Jardine's letter. One hand hung over the arm of her chair. Mr. Drew approached with quiet paces, and, taking this hand, before Madame von Marwitz could see him, he bowed over and kissed it. The manner of the salutation made of it at once a formality and a caress. Madame von Marwitz looked up quickly and withdrew her hand. "You startled me, my young friend," she said. In her gaze was a mingled severity and softness, and she smiled as if irrepressibly. Mr. Drew smiled back. "I've been wearying to escape from our host to come to you," he said. "He will talk to me about the reform of American politics. Why reform them? They are much more amusing unreformed, aren't they? And why talk to me about them? I think he wants me to write about them. Even if I were to write a book for the Americans, I would tell them that it is their mission to be amusing. Democracies must be either absurd or uninteresting. America began by being quite uninteresting, and now it has quite taken its place as absurd. I love to hear about their fat, bribed, clean-shaven senators, just as I love to read the advertisements of toothbrushes and breakfast foods and underwear in their magazines, written in the language of persuasive, familiar fraternity. It was difficult not to confess this to Mr. Asprey, but I do not think he would have understood me. Mr. Drew spoke in a soft, slightly sibilant voice, with little smiling pauses between sentences that all seemed vaguely shuffled together. He paused now, smiling, and looking down at Madame von Marwitz. "You speak foolishly," said Madame von Marwitz, "but he would have thought you wicked." "Because I like beauty and don't like democracy? I suppose so." Still smiling at her, he added, "One forgets democracies when one looks at you. You are very beautiful this morning." "I am not this morning in a mood for unconventionalities," Madame von Marwitz returned, meeting his gaze with her mingled severity and softness. And again, with composure, he ignored her severity and returned her smile. It would have been unfair to say that there was effrontery in Mr. Drew's gaze. It merely had its way with you, and, if you didn't like its way, passed from you unperturbed. With all his rather sickly grace and ambiguous placidity, Mr. Drew was not lacking in character. He had risen superior to a good many things, the dismal wife at Surbiton and the large-mouthed children perhaps among them, and he had won his detachment. The homage he offered was not unalloyed by humour. To a person of Madame von Marwitz's calibre, he seemed to say he would not pretend to raptures or reverences they had both long since seen through. It would bore him to be rapturous or reverent, and if you didn't like him, so his whole demeanour mildly demonstrated, you could leave him, or rather, he could leave you. So that when Madame von Marwitz sought to quell him, she found herself met with a gentle unawareness, even a gentle indifference. Cogitation and a certain disquiet were often in her eye when it rested on this devotee. "Does one make conventional speeches to the moon?" he now remarked, taking a chair beside her, and turning the brim of his white hat over his eyes, so that of his face only the sensual, delicate mouth and chin were in sunlight. "I shouldn't want to make speeches to you if you were conventional. You are done with your letters? May I talk to you?" "Yes, I have done. You may talk as foolishly as you please, but not unconventionally. Whether I am or am not conventional is not a matter that concerns you. I have had good news today. My little Karen is to marry." "Your little Karen? Which all of the myriads is this adorer?" "The child you saw me with in London, the one who stays in Cornwall." "You mean the fair, square girl who calls you Tante? I only remember of her that she was fair and square and called you Tante." "That is she. She is to marry an excellent young man, said Madame von Marwitz, slightly smiling at him, "who would never wish to make speeches to the moon, who is, indeed, not aware of the moon. But he is very much aware of Karen, so much so." And she continued to smile, as if over an amusing, if still slightly perplexing memory. "That when she is there, he is not aware of me. What do you say to that?" "I say," Mr. Drew replied, "that the barbarians will always be many and the civilized few." "Who is this barbarian?" "A Mr. Gregory Jardine." "Jardine? Connais pas," said Mr. Drew. "He is a cousin of our Scrotton's," said Madame von Marwitz, "and a man of law. Very stiff and clean, like a roll of expensive paper. He has asked me very nicely if he may inscribe the name of Mrs. Jardine upon a page of it. He is the sort of young man of law I think I distinguish." Madame von Marwitz mused, her eyes on the landscape. "Who does not smoke a briarwood pipe and ride on an omnibus, but who keeps good cigars in a silver box, and always takes a hansom. He will make Karen comfortable, and, I gather from her letter, happy. It will be a strange change of milieu for the child, but I have, I think, made her independent of milieus. She will write more than Mrs. Jardine on his scroll. It is a child of character." "And she will no longer be in Cornwall," Mr. Drew observed. "I am glad of that." "Why, pray? I am not glad of it. I shall miss my Karen at Les Solitudes. But I, you see, don't want to have other worshippers there when I go to stay with you," said Mr. Drew. "For, you know, you are going to let me stay a great deal with you in Cornwall. You will play to me, and I will write something that you will, perhaps, care to read. And the moon will be very kind and listen to many speeches. You know," he added, with a change of tone, "that I am in love with you. I must be alone with you at Les Solitudes." "Let us have none of that, if you please," said Madame von Marwitz. She looked away from him along the sunny stretches of the terrace, and she frowned slightly, though smiling on, as if with tolerant affection. And in her look was something half dazed and half resentful, like the look of a fierce wild bird, subdued by the warmth and fairness of an enclosing hand. End of chapter 12. Recording by Christoph.